Round 2 of the Qatar Masters Open took place today, and once again there were loads of interesting games and a few upsets. But I've gone with the game between Aravindh Chidambaram, who is a 16-year-old from India, against the world champion Magnus Carlsen. Of course, Carlsen drew in the first round, bit of an upset. So let's see how he got on today. He played a Sicilian against Chidambaram's e4. And now b3 from the Indian player. Now, this is not a critical variation against a Sicilian. However, it does lead to unusual positions, and I think in general that's a good policy if you're playing against a strong player. But Carlsen, after not too much thought, played g6, and this is quite a trendy way of playing against b3 at the moment. So bishop b2, and now knight f6. Probably not a very good idea to exchange off bishop for knight in this position, although at first glance you might think that white has good control over d5. In fact, black very quickly can, after castles, can get in f5 and has, well, a superb dark square bishop. So white plays correctly, e5 in this position. But what was not correct was that the Indian player thought for almost 40 minutes over that move. Now, if you're going to play b3, then you should probably be ready for something, well, this continuation with g6 and knight f6, which is, well, really quite popular at the moment. And yeah, to spend 39 minutes, almost 40 minutes over this move was a huge mistake, as we'll see. So e6. Okay, this shakes the game up a little bit, forces black to block this diagonal with f6. And now it's hard for white to exploit this slightly unusual setup that black has played. White took on d7. Carlsen recaptured with the queen. And now black's basic idea here is just to take control of the centre with knight c6 and e5 and get a really strong kind of Maróczy bind. It's not so easy for white to shake that one. Having said that, it's not a bad position for white. Knight c6 from Carlsen, and here, I would have expected something like bishop c4. I don't think it's so bad for white because, with the pawn on f6, black has to solve a few problems before getting his king to safety. His development isn't so simple. But Chidambaram played bishop b5, and I don't particularly like this move. Carlsen, after a little thought, played knight c7. Now, I think if the bishop drops back, it's perhaps not too bad, with similar ideas that it's not so easy for black to castle. Then again, I think if black just develops normally, and you can either play e6 and castle queenside, or perhaps flirt with castling queenside and e5, not such a bad idea. But instead, the Indian player exchanged bishop for knight on c6. Now, I think this is a clear indication that he was rather awestruck by his opponent. This is exactly what a strong player wants. Basically, Carlsen has the two bishops. His opponent even wants to go into an endgame, and so now, Carlsen also has control of the centre. I mean, this is a dream position for Carlsen out of the opening. His pieces stand so well. Look at that knight looking at these important squares on d4 and f4 and a beautiful light squared bishop. So yeah, I'm afraid Chidambaram looks overawed at this point in the game. However, let's see what happened. I think black's only problem in this position is choosing which path to take, and there are many decent ways to play this position. Maybe the most straightforward one is just to play bishop g7, castles queenside, and rooks in the middle, and maybe go for f5. Instead, Carlsen went bishop e7, which also looks fantastic. And now he lashed out on the queenside with b5. He's going for total domination, total control of the board. But maybe he underestimated White's counterplay in this position. Because after rook e1, well, suddenly kind of things are starting to happen. He has to watch out for this move f4. So king f7. And now knight e1 looks really slow, but in fact that knight is coming to e3. It'll protect g2, and then f4 starts to look like a real threat. And it's not clear, well, in theory it's nice to gain space with b5, but actually it's not really completely relevant in this position. Carlsen continued to hammer up on the queen side, but after knight e3 he has to be very careful here. For example, after a4, then f4 is, I think, a good move. If e4, then f5 breaks things open, and obviously exchanging starts to put a lot of pressure on the f6 pawn, and that knight not looking bad, and certainly that bishop on b2 excellently placed. Or if g5, now that's kind of a safe move, clamping the f4 square, but of course there's a downside to that because the knight comes into f5. Black still has a huge space advantage and must be better here, but White has found his feet. So Carlsen played bishop d6, also looking at the f4 square. But after knight c3 and then a4, matters weren't so simple. Now, a tricky choice for Black. Do you exchange here and keep the queenside open to some degree, but then again, White's knight finds a nice square on c4, and then bishop c3, well, both pieces looking at the a5 pawn. I mean, Black's not in danger of losing that pawn, because a rook can always come here, but still not so comfortable. So Carlsen decided to keep the position relatively closed on the queen side. And although White has that square for the knight, well, the bishop covers the a5 pawn without any difficulty and still exercises influence over this side of the board as well. Nevertheless, White is definitely finding his feet in this position. Now h4 from Carlsen. Okay, it's a useful move. It's nice to gain some space. I thought that White would perhaps just wait here with h3 or maybe rook f2. Instead he lashed out with g4. I mean, to me this looks very strange because Carlsen, this is what he played, brings his rook into play. But maybe Carlsen underestimated his opponent here, because after g4 this is suddenly very tricky actually. For example, let's say the king steps aside, then White plays g5, undermining the pawn on e5, and that's pretty nasty. Or rook h8, g5 works again in this position as well. I mean, maybe the safest is to play g5 and bring the rook over. I mean, this stops any of White's pawn breaks, but of course it's going to be hard to break down White's position when his knights have found pretty decent squares in the centre of the board. Instead, Carlsen played rook d8, so covering the d6 square, but he must have underestimated g5. This is an excellent move, and the basic problems are, if knight takes g5, then bishop takes e5, and well, that's really unpleasant. Or f takes g5, bishop takes e5. There are lots of horrible tactics here to negotiate. And after bishop e4, well, not rook e4 because then knight g5, but f takes e4. and you can see there's a nasty pin here. If knight takes g5, which should be the best move for black in this position, then again the pin is exploited, and then, well, let's say knight c4, looking at the a5 pawn. I think black's problem in this position is that it's very easy for white to play. I mean, maybe you break with e5. That knight is beautifully placed. It's very hard for black to stir up trouble here. But by this stage, Chithambaram was already short of time, and Carlsen decided to gamble. He played knight f4, a risky move, but it keeps activity. White took on f6. Now, of course, that can't be captured again. White exploits the pin. So the king goes to e6. That holds the pawn. That's very important. But white now a pawn up, and not a bad pawn on f6. Knight came back to e3. Good move. Looking at some key squares here. g5. So now Carlsen trying to take the initiative by pushing his g-pawn. And it's getting very tense indeed. Knight d5 from white. Chithambaram was basically playing on his increment now. The time control was 90 minutes to get to 90 minutes plus 30 seconds for each move played, and of course 40 moves, time control at 40 moves. So, well, he wants to get rid of this knight on f4, and after this exchange, then that pawn would have a lot of support. So bishop d6, and now rook g1, looking at that g-pawn. Now Carlsen could have exchanged here and taken on f6, and the king does support the g-pawn, but this one is going to be tough to win. It's far less complicated than a couple of moves ago. So Carlsen decided to keep the tension. Excellent decision. Rook g8, defending that pawn, but it's tricky. Now here, with the benefit of hindsight, white should probably move the king to either b1 or d1. Instead, he played rook g4. And then rook h1. Excuse me, rook h4. And if white exchanges, then okay, we've got a pretty random position on the board, but that king is doing a good job of blockading the pawns, and black has two of these trying to get down the other side of the board. So white came back again, and now the pawn advanced. Now it's getting tricky. That rook g4 move, definitely a mistake. Carlsen has the initiative now. And once again, I'm sure Carlsen would have wanted the exchange on f4 with two huge passed pawns here. So knight e3 from white. He's going backwards and forwards, and g3. And this sets an evil trap. This is a really nice move. I mean, white's best chance here is f7, but even then should be better for black. But knight f5 was definitely a mistake. This looks so strong. When you're just playing on with seconds left, you leap at a move like knight f5, looking at the rook on h4, looking at the pawn on g3, looking at the bishop on d6, threatening something like f7. But after this incredibly cool move, rook h8, very easy to overlook such a retreat, white is lost. The point is that if white takes on g3, then there's a horrible back rank trick here, and knight e2. Of course, if that's taken, then there's mate on h1, and otherwise there is a dastardly fork. Likewise, rook g3 could be met by knight e2. So f7, and this looks like it saves the day for white, but rook g6 is a really cool move. So that means that after knight takes, well, you can just capture here and the rook covers. That's why the rook had to go back to the back rank, so this rook could move up and maintain protection of the pawn. King d1 played, and after g2 by Magnus, Chithambaran actually lost on time, but now his position is really probably gone. Best chance, well, I'm not sure there's a best chance here, but if d3, then knight h3, and if rook e3, well, that kind of prevents knight h3 for the moment, but you withdraw the bishop, then you take, and then you're threatening this again, or rook h1. White must be lost there. So I'm not even sure how to judge that game. I think once White ran so short of time, then, well, against someone as experienced as Carlsen, he's probably going to lose. But it was very instructive to see how Carlsen managed to maintain the tension, maintain the complications in the position to win. But he certainly underestimated White's chances. Just before I go, let me show you my finish of the day. Was in the game between Niels Grandelius from Sweden and Anish Giri. This was a really complicated Najdorf. You can see Giri's king wandering around the middle of the board. But black is definitely better here. If that king is checked, then it just wanders up the board and it's actually completely safe. After b3, well, as I said, White is looking pretty bad here. The game finished like this, and now if knight takes b3, then that's a rook gone, and in the game c takes b3 and queen e2 was the final move of the game. A really beautiful finish. If knight takes queen, then knight d2 and rook a8. Checkmate. Wonderful stuff. So Giri has 2 out of 2. The big upset today was that Kramnik with White only drew against the Polish player Purun. Wesley So defeated Naroditsky. Karyakin only drew against Salem, a very dangerous player from the UAE. Anyway, it's still early days. More to come. Thanks for watching.